Welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, October 18th, 2024. Happy Friday. Today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election according to swing state polling data that we see on 538 that we can use to map out our 2024 Electoral College map. It's a very interesting one and one that comes at a time where the election has become increasingly narrower over the past week. I know you've heard me talk about how close this race was and has been over the past 2 months, but it is now getting to a point where the odds in even places like the 538 forecast, which is pretty consistently had Vice President Harris up 55 to 45, 53 to 47. The race is tightening and it's 52 to 48, and likely by tomorrow, it's very possible that our forecast here ends up somewhere around 50-50. And that's because the data points have really gotten tighter in these battleground states. Leads for candidates that amount to less than a point really drive us in the direction of unknowing how this election process is going to go. But what's always important, too, is tracking what the polls currently say about the battleground states, what the polls currently predict for the sake of the election, because that's really what will make or break the candidacies for both of these political parties. Now, I'm not going to spend time in looking at the polling data across the safe Democratic and safe Republican states. I honestly think that would be largely a waste of time. But what I am going to do here is just get us to a point of understanding, once we get past those safe states, what the numbers are saying in states ranging from Virginia to New Mexico to New Hampshire to Texas to Minnesota to Florida to Georgia to Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all in reverse order here. Honestly, maybe I'll do that order just to make things a little bit more interesting. But all in all here, looking at the Electoral College from the lens of states that will likely be decided by margins of roughly, maybe, you're talking 8 points, 10 points or less. So let's go ahead and spend our time characterizing all of these states that are currently safe Democratic, safe Republican, not Pennsylvania. Let me go ahead and fix that one. One thing I will say, just as a side note, if you're ever interested in looking at what really strong electoral performances look like for the Democratic Party, the 2008 election is a really, really good example of how super strong races can translate, super strong national candidates, people like Barack Obama, can translate to really strong performances in the swing states. I was looking at some of those margins. I know we know them, and we know that Obama did so well, but the extent at which he did so well is really quite fascinating. If you look at Pennsylvania, you look at Wisconsin, you look at Michigan, well, this is why I constantly reject that notion that this race, is like 2008, because by, every standard, it's not. Right, that race was so much more lopsided in favor of the Democratic Party. Obviously, enthusiasm levels are at 2008 style high for Democrats, but it doesn't mean independents are as on board with the Democratic nominee this time around. So just look at that. If you're ever interested in looking at a bit of electoral history, you'll be shocked by some of those swing state margins. States like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Michigan was over 15 points, I kid you not. Right? Fascinating that Michigan could be on par with that of a safe blue state now, given how close it is. Really interesting. All around, very interesting stuff. Besides that point, I want to get back to our focus here, the 2024 election. I'm just about done characterizing all of the safe Republican states and safe Democratic states. I'm going to get 2 states out of the way, South Carolina and Alaska. New poll out of Alaska shows Donald Trump up 8 points across the state, a reduction in support from 2020, still an 8-point victory, up from 4 points that we saw roughly a month ago. In South Carolina, the polls here on average have him hovering roughly, somewhere around, 10, 11, 13, 14 points. It's going to be a likely state. I need to go ahead and actually open up Ohio so we can look at those states first. I realized that I wasn't able to bring those up prior to this. So Ohio and Iowa, 2 states that I don't really think we'd need to spend too much time talking about. What's interesting, though, is that of recent, the polls here in Iowa give Donald Trump roughly about a 5.5% advantage. In Ohio, an 8% advantage. It's always interesting that, there are some instances where Ohio is actually voting to the right of Iowa back in 2016 and 2020. That simply was not the case, but maybe it could be that Midwestern strength that we've seen from people like Tim Walz in areas like Minnesota, which neighbors Iowa, and also to Kamala Harris that we've surprisingly seen in some of these Rust Belt battleground states. Regardless, though, Ohio and Iowa come into the fray as likely Republican states. Now, Democrats are in a pretty solid position when it comes down to Maine at large and Maine's first district here, but that second district is a little bit pesky. Same thing with Nebraska. We'll look at the polls there soon. But these remaining states are the ones that I do have substantive margins on, substantive data points on that we can use to pretty much predict, just based on what the polls are telling us about these states. Iowa and Ohio, South Carolina, and Alaska have already been filled in with the polls, but these are the states that really are going to see many more investments from the national party, many more discussions and conversations around, who's going to win, who's not going to win this cycle in specific. We will likely see the least amount of investments in some of these surrounding states that are not as competitive compared to 2012, 2016, 2020, where there were heavy investments across the board and more, narrow-focused investments across those 7 battleground states that we've been talking about for quite some time. Now, I want to kick this off by looking at the state of Virginia, a state that right now Kamala Harris holds roughly a 7.5% advantage. And so when I talked to you about Alaska, which we saw a reduction in support for Trump, Iowa, we saw a reduction in support for Trump, Ohio's roughly even with that of the last election, Virginia, we're seeing a reduction in support for Vice President Harris. So this is a state that Biden won by 10 points. Kamala Harris leads by 7.5. It's still a likely victory. Granted, too, Democrats are not investing in the state the same way they did in 2020. They're not focusing on the state the same way they did in 2016. The running mate for the party was from Virginia in 2016. So a lot more was at play and benefit for the Democrats in the past 2 races in Virginia, which might be the reason why this state is narrowing up right to a point where Kamala Harris is losing a bit of support but still largely winning the state. Obviously, that's something we can talk about at length in future videos, but for right now, we're going to move past it. Kamala Harris up 7.5%. When you take a look at the state of Maine, this is a state where I think the statewide average isn't something that is necessarily too important, but it is that 2nd district average that gives Donald Trump a very narrow upper hand. Now, the University of New Hampshire released data points back in August saying Kamala Harris had a 5-point advantage. The most recent data points say that Donald Trump holds a 7-point advantage. The state of the race from August is certainly not the state of the race from September and is certainly not the state of the race from October. One thing is consistent, the race is close, but we did start to see some Republican reversions in terms of them winning back some support they lost at the high point for Kamala Harris. Regardless, though, when you average out these states, Maine's 2nd district becomes a lean Republican state. Might be a little surprising because it is to me. I think it's going to be a likely red district. But the polling data, when averaged out, gives Kamala Harris a better performance here than Joe Biden, but still a loss across Maine's 2nd and still a likely margin across the state. New Hampshire is the next state I would take a look at when it comes down to margin here. Kamala Harris holding a 6.8% advantage, largely running even with that of the last election in 2020. It was roughly 7.2%. So still something there for Democrats to improve upon, but regardless, you're seeing that state largely run even with that of the 2020 election, which is good news for Kamala Harris. Moving over to the next state, the state of New Mexico, Kamala Harris holds a 7-point advantage. Another reduction in support here, kind of in line, too, with what we've been seeing from the 2020 race. Those Sunbelt states, especially the border states, we've seen some reversions in support away from Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party. Could be a variety of reasons. Could be immigration. Could be the southern border. Whatever it is. Could be, the loss in support amongst Hispanic voters across the country we've seen to the Democratic Party. These are things that are pretty consistent and the Democrats need to overcome and combat and win back voters, because what we're seeing in a lot of these data points is that Hispanic voters are not solid. They're not solid on Trump. They're not solid on Harris. There is time and reason that there can be investments to sway these voters. That's why both candidates did the Univision Town Hall. That's why both candidates are running TV ads in Spanish in Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. They're doing an intentional, personalized outreach effort on both sides of the aisle to win back voters that could be in their column, could be the other column, and right now truly are up in the air. New Mexico is one of those states, which is why we are likely seeing a bit of decrease in support from the 2020 race. The next state I would look at is the state of Texas, which recently we saw a brand new poll today. Actually, I don't think it's here on the average. Donald Trump holding a 6-point advantage, roughly running even with that of the margin of the average here, but an improvement from the 2020 election and a likely characterization. Something that we can probably expect to, given the shift in New Mexico and Nevada and Arizona. Texas makes sense to fall right in line there as a shifting state, but still, Kamala Harris and, Tim Walz are in a position where Texas still is a more competitive state than it has been in many previous elections, with the exception of 2020. And that's fundamentally good news for Democrats, because even in a bad time where approval ratings surrounding immigration and the southern border are at an all-time low for Democrats, especially the incumbent president, if Kamala Harris is still coming within 6 points of the state, that means something for future elections and elections even beyond the immediate future, 2032, 2036, that Texas is in play. Moving beyond that, we're going to take a look at Minnesota, a state that Tim Walz is from. Went to Biden by 7 points in the last election. I do think that the polling is absolutely missing something here. I do not think there's a circumstance in which Kamala Harris wins Minnesota by less than Joe Biden did, with the running mate being the governor of Minnesota, who has had more impressive victories in both cycles than Joe Biden, despite harsher odds in 2022. The results here, I think, in Minnesota are going to be pretty clear on election night, probably an 8 or 9 point margin. The polls, though, indicate that Kamala Harris is up by roughly 6 points. Looking at Nebraska, Specific to that second congressional district here, they have an average, not an average, but they have a number of polls here. Kamala Harris, point being, is going to be in a likely characterization in Nebraska second. That race is likely going to be decided by 7, 8, 9 points. Very big advantage for Kamala Harris, an improvement off of 2020, because again, nothing is ever consistent in American politics. Laugh out loud at that point. But Nebraska second. Likely for the Democrats. Florida, though, likely for the Republicans. Donald Trump holds a 5.3% advantage. It was a bit narrower before. The data seemed to suggest that Florida might be back in play. The data no longer suggests that. Florida becomes a 5.3% margin. It's 30 electoral votes. Pretty big victory for Donald Trump. You can expect to win it on election night. That boosts him up to 219 electoral votes. Now, I'm missing Colorado, which I completely forgot that I was missing. So we're going to go ahead and shift over to Colorado. I don't know if there's ever been pretty substantive data points since she became the nominee. I don't think so, even just based on looking at some of these numbers. The average here is that she wins the state by roughly a likely margin, but not an extensively polled state. Donald Trump actually was campaigning out in Colorado the other day. I don't know what that's really going to do for him, but seems to think it'll do something. So maybe it's worth his time. In Georgia, Donald Trump holds a 1.2% advantage. So looking at that data point, 1.2% advantage puts Donald Trump roughly at 235 electoral votes. He wins the state about a 2-point shift from the last election, similar to that of what we're seeing in those Sunbelt states like Arizona and Nevada and Texas. It's a pretty consistent shift nationwide. The question is, can Kamala Harris win despite the shift? Well, we'll go ahead and wait and see based on some of these other data points. Arizona has Donald Trump up by 1.8%, very similar shift to that of Georgia. Very much seem to vote together as well. We saw it in 2020, 2016, 2012, 2008, 2000, 2004. Moving forward, they might vote together, and they might vote together again in 2024. The next state I'd look at is North Carolina, where Donald Trump's advantage is just 0.7%, and I say just 0.7% because it's actually a reduction in support from 2020. I think a lot of what we can attribute to that is the fact that Democrats are investing in North Carolina like there's no tomorrow. They're visiting the state a lot more than they did in previous elections, and just based on, again, focus groups of what Kamala Harris does in fact drive out amongst the Democratic electorate. You're talking about black voters in specific. You're talking about women voters. Huge chunks of the electorate in North Carolina comprise of a compounding set of factors for the campaign that could boost their base to turn out and vote. Makes sense that the state is a bit narrower than 2020, but still ends up with the Trump victory because at the end of the day, he holds the upper hand in some of these Sunbelt states. The next state I'd look at is the state of Nevada, where Kamala Harris holds the narrowest 0.7% advantage across the state. Now, not much data has come out of Nevada recently. Only a few recent points have shown Donald Trump in a very interesting position. Morning Consult says Harris is up by 4. Fabrizio Lee, they do a poll. Donald Trump sponsored it, so granted, keep that in mind when we're looking at these numbers. They see Trump leads by 3. The Wall Street Journal did a poll way back when in September, said Donald Trump led by 6. It really is all over the place. The point being, though, Kamala Harris holds a narrow advantage, and that puts her at 232 electoral votes, which is the number that Hillary Clinton got in the 2016 election. Same number that Donald Trump also got in the 2020 presidential election. And so, as we fill out, this could be a really interesting map. Should Donald Trump win these remaining 3 states, we'd end up with 306 to 232, which is the exact same electoral margin of 2016 and 2020. And, God forbid in a way, 2024, because the discourse on that would be really, really annoying. But here we are, final 44 electoral votes. Let's start off with the state of Michigan. Michigan right now holds Kamala Harris at the advantage point of 0.6%, certainly less than where she was before. In September, she was leading by 3 points across the state. Today, it has absolutely narrowed. The support there has not increased for Kamala Harris. It has not increased much for Donald Trump either. The margins have narrowed for Kamala Harris. Decreased on her part, Donald Trump remaining roughly even. At his ceiling that we've seen, Kamala Harris holds a narrow advantage, boosting her up to 247 electoral votes. Now, when it comes down to Pennsylvania, Kamala Harris holds the narrow lead again. 0.4% based on those data points. 0.4% for Kamala Harris, bringing her up to 266 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 262. Now, this race and these 2 races, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and also a group in Wisconsin here, these 3 races are going to be amongst the closest of the cycle. Based on the data points, they are the closest so far, and I do think we are going to see these states take days to call. A lot of questions surrounding, what could have been done better for both candidates, given how close the margins were. I remember that was the discussion in Arizona, in Georgia. In Arizona, it was the case of John McCain. In Georgia, it was the case of, all these things that were too extreme for voters in Atlanta. In Wisconsin, it was the case of not visiting it as much and spending as much time because you were focused on Pennsylvania and Michigan. Point being, these states are states that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris can absolutely win. And based on where we are right now, Kamala Harris seems to hold the upper advantage in Pennsylvania and Michigan, according to the polls. And Wisconsin is the final state here. holds the narrowest advantage of 0.2%, despite being the state that Kamala Harris had the largest lead in back in August, around 4 points statewide. Today has narrowed to just 0.2%. Some recent data points showing some strong results for the former president on average here. A very, very, very narrow advantage for Kamala Harris, which would bring her to 276 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 262. Now, the last thing I want to answer here is, do we trust the polls? Do we trust the polls to give us an accurate depiction of what the election actually looks like? And in a way, I say, maybe. I think when we look at data points like this and just how narrow they are, given that they give us a 4% margin of error, it really isn't that easy to predict. And that's because while the polls on average might be telling us something, they all share similar averages in terms of error points. It could be as much as a Kamala Harris 4-point victory in Wisconsin or a Donald Trump 3.5-point victory in Wisconsin. And that's why it's really difficult to gauge the elections right now. Back in 2020, Wisconsin was a 7-point state in favor of Biden. We knew that the race would be closer than that, but even if the polls were wrong, there was enough margin of error there that Joe Biden would still end up winning the state. And he did. In Michigan, a similar story. In Pennsylvania, a similar story. But those are not the data points we're seeing for Kamala Harris. And this race, undeniably, is much closer for Democrats than it was in 2020. And a lot better for Donald Trump than it was in 2020 as well. This race is very much going to come down to the wire. Democrats should never and can never be complacent over the next 18 days, and neither can Republicans. These states are going to be determined just by a fraction of the electorate. Just a handful of voters out there who say, decide on election day. Now I'm voting for Trump. Now I'm voting for Harris. Those are decisions they will make that will dictate the future of this nation. And based on where we are right now, while the numbers may say that, Kamala Harris is losing North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, and Donald Trump is losing Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, it could go in the entirely opposite direction just because of how close these races are, how close the polls are, and where we are today is not super strong for either candidate and not a point of security by any metric, which is why every single point and every single thing matters from here on out between now and Election Day. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.